Okay. Okay, well, people will likely join as we go, but to make sure we get started on time, let me thank you for joining again this month. We are going to have a discussion, which I guess I probably thought we would talk about these things about fiscal policy, but probably a few years ago, I didn't think they were that relevant for monetary policy, but I guess we live in interesting times. So the broad theme of today is essentially the interaction of politics and central bank communication, politics and expectation formation. And so I'm delighted to welcome our two speakers, and I have to thank them both for testing their own body clocks in different directions. So we're going to go in the order. Yoon from Texas A&M will go first and is presenting nice and early in the morning. And then Pei from University of Macau has stayed up very late to present for us. So thank you both for being here. The plan is we will do 20 to 25 minutes of the sort of specific research presentations by the two presenters. During that time, if you in the audience have questions, there is a Q&A facility. I will monitor that and I will put questions to them when it works. If for some reason, your question doesn't get asked at that point, we plan to have some time at the end when we can have a wider discussion. And so, if I miss it live, apologies, but we will get to it hopefully by the end. Okay, without further ado, Yoon, do you want to share your screen and we'll start with your presentation, which is about how partisanship shapes, that's actually hard to say in a row, how partisanship shapes economic expectations, looking at the US tariff announcement, or Liberation Day, as we like to call it. Go ahead.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, thank you for having me here. I'm happy to present my paper, How Partisanship Shapes Economic Expectations. This is joint work with Jorge and Taewon from Texas A&M University. So this paper is about the Liberation Day. You must all aware of this event. On that day, President Trump announced a major shift in U.S. trade policy, including 10% universal tariff on all imported goods, as well as country-specific reciprocal tariff. These tariff rates were much larger than we expected, and at the time, economists widely anticipated negative economic consequences, and we saw stock market collapse, and then financial institutions revised their probability of having recession upward at the time. But our question comes a little different. So although economists had somewhat agreed on what's going to happen to the economy, is it also true for the household? So this paper is going to try to investigate what is the subjective models of tariff. And then we're going to ask whether there's any heterogeneity on that policy transmission. Spoiler alert. We find political affiliation plays a major role to explain any heterogeneity in subjective models of tariff. And then we ask whether we can close the gap of partisan divergence by providing politically neutral and research-based information. To do so, this will give you a brief overview of our paper's results. We did our survey shortly after the Liberation Day, and we found we first examined subjective models of tariff, and we found on average, actually, people expect higher inflation and unemployment in response to tariff announcement, which then somewhat agree with how economists or professionals thought about it. But we found substantial heterogeneity across partisan lines. Specifically, Democrats anticipated larger increase in both inflation and unemployment than Republicans. And then the later part of the paper, we really tried to investigate whether providing politically neutral, research-based information can reduce the gap of partisan expectations. And what we found is providing information related to inflation, like how tariff would affect inflation, actually raises inflation expectation, but that was especially among Democrats, while providing information about how tariff affected unemployment at the time of 2018 and 19 tariff war raised unemployment expectation, but this revision are mostly done by Republicans. So we found that having neutral information is not enough to close the gap of partisan expectations entirely. So our paper contributes to many literature, and we know there's a massive literature on political polarization. And the Pei later will present about his paper how a partisan gaps in trust in the Fed actually contributed this divergent macroeconomic belief. And our paper is the paper now say this partisan divergence actually extends beyond central bank, and we're going to investigate role of fiscal policy or government actions that contributes to partisan expectations. Let me start introducing our survey design first. So in our survey, which is done in one way, we first collected demographic and political preferences. And later we elicited pre-treatment expectations about inflation, unemployment, and sentiment. And we provided how tariff policy was at the time of Liberation Day. And shortly after we collected or we elicited subjective models of tariff, so we basically asked how households expected this tariff policy would affect inflation, unemployment, and stock prices. And then we provided this information randomly. So we divided our respondents in randomly into a few groups and see if how they responded this randomly provided information. To do so, we also elicited post-treatment expectations and see how they revise their expectations. Our sample size is about 1,200, and we did our survey using Prolific, which gives about 200 sample sizes for each treatment. So before we move on to any subjective models, I'm going to show you how descriptive statistics look like. And what we find here for inflation expectations and unemployment expectations are very consistent with the previous literature. There's a substantial heterogeneity across demographic characteristics. So we all know from the previous literature, older populations tend to have higher inflation expectations, and female tend to have higher inflation expectations, and low educated respondents tend to have higher expectations. We also know about the partisan gap and inflation expectations. So at the time, president was a Republican. So, and then previous literature says for those respondents who would support the same party with incumbent president's party tend to have lower inflation expectations. So we saw Republican had lower inflation expectations than Democrat, and that goes same for political ideology as well. And all this heterogeneity goes same for unemployment expectations as well. So Republicans tend to have a little optimistic belief about the economy, and they have lower unemployment expectations compared to Democrat. Now we have set how expectations look like. I'm gonna move on to subjective models of tariff. So to elicit how they think this tariff would affect the economy, we provided information about US trade policy changes at the time. And that includes, again, 10% universal tariff and also country-specific tariff. And we tried to write this information page as neutral as possible. And by the time we did our survey on April 11th, there were so many policy updates at the time. So we also summarized all the policy updates between April 2nd and April 11th. And after this page describing tariff policy change, we used open-ended question to elicit unprompted thoughts on this policy. So we asked, in your own words, how do you think the recently announced tariff would affect the US economy? Surprisingly, more than 20% of people actually mentioned inflation. And I think this reflects a wide media news coverage about inflation concern after the tariff policy announcement. What is very surprising is Democrats mentioned more about recession risk, but Republicans, who are shown in red color here, mention a lot about US jobs or long-term gains. So even open-ended question, we can see this partisan belief on how this tariff would affect the economy. Now, we also asked directional questions on how this tariff would affect the economy, especially for inflation and unemployment and stock prices. And what we can see is, again, consistent with what we saw earlier, especially for inflation, there's some broad consensus. 82% of respondents really believe that tariff would raise inflation. But we see more divided view on how it would affect unemployment and stock prices. So for unemployment, 63% of respondents expected unemployment to rise. So that's where households believe somewhat differently from professionals or economists. And then we ask whether the subjective models of tariff do show heterogeneity across different dimensions. So this graph shows you how subjective models are different based on demographic characteristics or political affiliation. What is very striking is there's no heterogeneity across observable demographics. So in our paper, we also show how it is different for SS status or labor market status and so on. There is no heterogeneity whatsoever except political affiliation. So for example, if you see this one, Democrat actually expected 94% of Democrat respondents actually expected inflation to increase, but 68% of Republicans believe that tariff policy would raise inflation. This is very stark contrast if we think about how inflation expectation look like, because inflation expectation tend to be very heterogeneous across demographic characteristics as well. So if we see the results for unemployment, that results goes the same. So age, gender, ethnicity, education doesn't seem to matter in heterogeneous subjective models of tariff, but a political affiliation really matters to show the heterogeneous pattern. Again, 83% of Democrats expected unemployment to increase, but 40% of Republicans thought that unemployment would increase, but the other 34% respondent actually believed that unemployment would decrease. So we find this political affiliation dimension is very key dimension to show heterogeneity in subjective models of tariff. So once we set this ground that how policy would affect the economy, subjective models of how policy would affect the economy is really different dependent on political affiliation or ideology. We really wanted to test whether we can close or reduce the gap in partisan expectations. To do so, we did randomized experiment. So we divided sample into 6. But for the first control group, we didn't give any additional information. For the initial 3 group, we provided findings from academic research based on impact of 2018 and 2019 trade wars for inflation, employment, and stock prices, respectively. We do have additional information treatment about media news coverage about economic forecast using different news media outlet. One is for Fox News, the other one is New York Times. But for the sake of time, today's presentation, I'm going to focus on for initial 3 treatment. After our randomized experiment, we also check whether observable characteristics balance across the groups, and our randomization was successful to achieve this balance. So now I'm going to show you what kind of piece of information we provided for our respondents. So for every information treatment, we start with this short preface. it does say this research is coming from 2018 and 19 trade war. And at the time, tariff rate was much lower. It was 3.5% compared to the current one. It was much lower. And we mentioned that that is coming from economic research. And then they used latest economic technique to understand causal relationship between tariff and inflation. So this is a summary of inflation treatment. There we summarized academic research finding mentioning a 10% have raised import prices about 9.4%. So we emphasize near complete pass-through of tariff to import prices. And they mentioned price increases were mostly for those tariff targeted goods, but for those non-targeted goods, prices didn't really change. We also show the main figure of the academic research paper. There, they again show that those products targeted by tariff had a large price increases compared to those products not targeted. And we'll move on to the next treatment. This treatment does convey information about how tariff affected employment from David Otter et al.'s paper. There, they show tariff on foreign goods actually did not raise job for those newly protected sector, which you can see from this event specification. And but instead, for those sectors who had to face with the retaliatory tariff from foreign government, actually did have lost their jobs. So we saw that we mentioned that for those sectors who had to have retaliatory tariff had a job loss with this graph as well. And then for the next treatment, we also showed how earlier announcement of the tariff affected stock market prices. And after announcement, you can see there's a huge significant loss in stock market returns. So now I'm gonna show you how this randomly providing information actually revise inflation expectation for those respondents relative to control group. So on the left-hand side, there's a revision in inflation expectations. And what we can see over here is people who had received more information about near complete pass-through actually raised inflation expectations. But actually, people who had received information about employment or stock prices didn't change inflation expectations. And this does seem to suggest people respond to more direct and salient information to revise their economic belief. The second result is about unemployment expectations. And what we can see is, again, for those people who had additional information about how tariff affected employment at the time of 2018 and 19 tariff war, they revised their unemployment expectations upward, but not inflation or stock prices treatment. For the next, we're gonna think about who really revised inflation expectations. So far we have set our ground that household subjective models of tariff are a little different from how professionals or economists think about it, and providing a new piece of information about academic research seems to revise households' belief. And we're very curious about this new information would correct or would bring agreement across the households in terms of subjective models of belief. So now we divided our respondents into a few groups, see if who really revised their inflation expectations or unemployment expectations. Our first prior was this revision must depend on prior subjective models. But we find surprisingly is actually for those people who thought that inflation wouldn't rise, didn't actually revise their inflation expectations upward. So we think it's the reason why we ended up having not much of significant result over here is because at the time there's broad consensus that tariff would raise inflation already. Now we wanted to see whether we can close the gap of partisan expectations. For that, we actually divided our group to Democrat or liberal or Republican conservatives to see how inflation expectation responded. Surprisingly, Democrats who already had higher inflation expectations did raise inflation expectation even further. So what does it mean? Our information treatment, which is coming from academic research, did not really close the gap of partisan expectation, but rather they widened this partisan gap in inflation expectations. So what happens to unemployment expectations? For unemployment at the time, if you remember our subjective model section, they had a less agreement on how tariff would affect the economy. So for those people who thought that tariff wouldn't raise unemployment, actually raise unemployment expectations. So I think really corrected for those people who had a different belief compared to the economist. We also again see how it is different across political affiliation. Again, in this case, we find different results from the inflation expectation results. Inflation expectation at the time, Democrat or Liberal are the one who are adjusting, but this time Republican and Conservative are the one who are adjusting their unemployment expectations. In this case, they raise unemployment expectations even upward. In this case, we can observe this partisan gap and unemployment expectation somewhat narrows. So how do we end up finding these two different results for inflation expectations versus unemployment expectations? We think it's more like joint behavior about subjective models of tariff and how new or surprising our information treatment was. So after information treatment, we asked whether they learned something new from information treatment. And for the inflation treatment, slightly more respondents mentioned that they learned something new compared to the Republicans. But for the employment treatment, substantially more Republicans mentioned that they learned something new compared to the Democrat. And we think that how novel information treatment itself somewhat led to different adjustment and inflation expectation and unemployment expectation respectively, and to show that we do have also regression results, see how we interacted our treatment dummy with how they learned something new or not, and we saw for those Democrat actually who learned something new revise their inflation expectation upward. And for the Republican, actually, regardless of how new information it was, they both raised unemployment expectations upward, which seems to suggest actually importance of prior subjective models itself as well. So to conclude, we actually documented partisan bias in their subjective models of tariff. And what we found is views on unemployment was very polarized. However, this providing politically neutral research-based information wasn't enough to close the gap between inflation expectations or unemployment expectations. So a natural future research question is how can we align households' subjective models with the professional ones? And there we can start with Michael's new paper. We shouldn't just give information, we should teach information so that households can align their subjective models somewhat similar to professional ones.
Perfect
And that,
timing, and for me at least, that's the perfect ending. Now, before we go on to Pei's paper, let me ask. I have two sort of questions that I wanted to ask. So the first one is more on, could you at all tell if any of the respondents anticipated that what was announced would maybe not be a persistent change in policy? Now, again, I don't think economists did, but we've certainly seen that there has been, you know, tariffs have gone up, they've gone down a lot, they've gone up a lot, and so maybe some people in your survey just thought, well, what happened on Liberation Day was like an opening gambit, but wasn't actually going to be the policies, and maybe they deeply understand that for to have the unemployment and inflation effects, these things are going to have to stay in the system for a little bit. Do you get any sense of that from responses?
So we do have a few open-ended questions, whether they understood this policy, whether they were aware of this policy, or whether they understood the mechanism behind of it. But we haven't actually looked up whether they mentioned temporary or persistent change. So we can actually go back to our open-ended question to see if they understood or they form expectation around temporary or persistent nature of the shock.
Okay, excellent. My second one, and let me just remind, if anyone has questions, put them in the Q&A, or else I'll come to them for the wider discussion later. My second one was, your treatment was quite complex. I mean, you were
Yes,
really you were trying to show them something, I don't know.
very complex.
I would feel a little nervous showing my undergrads this, but I'd have to really talk them through it. And so I immediately thought that your results were going to shout out confirmation bias. They're going to, like, if you tell me research does something I think is right, I'd say, yes, definitely, excellent, I agree with that. And I'll move more strongly. But that's not what you found with the unemployment. I mean, your unemployment result is really heartening. People who we think might be sort of doctrinaire and that this is the view actually seem to be swayed by a relatively technical diff and diff type picture and an explanation that some clever researchers did. I'm going to take a lot of joy from that result.
So when we designed our information treatment, we actually did our test in our undergraduate class, and we were very worried about whether people would understood this information treatment itself. So that's why we actually did add a comprehension question. So we asked whether they understood the key message of the information treatment. So for the employment treatment, we asked whether they understood that there is no job gain for the newly protected sector, but there was a job loss for those retaliatory sector. But they understood, and then 92% of them actually passed the comprehension question. So they didn't understand all the details about diff and event specification and so on, but they understood the main message of the academic research.
Good. I'm glad. You've
Yes.
obviously got good undergrads as well, but also a good sample. Excellent.
Yes.
Okay, let's leave this paper here for now. We'll come back to partisanship and expectations, I'm sure, during Pei's talk. But Pei, do you want to take over and talk about the polarized public?
Okay, yeah. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining this session. Thank you, Michael, for inviting me. So this is joint work with Michael Weber at Purdue University and Shihan Xie at the UIUC. There's a broad consensus central bank independence fosters desirable macroeconomic outcomes and financial stability. And institutions like the Fed are designed to be above politics. Certain features of the Fed are designed to limit the short-term political influences. However, public misperceptions about the Fed could arise for at least a few reasons. First, the public has a limited understanding of the Fed's institutional framework and the decision-making rationale, leaving them susceptible to misconceptions. And then second, central banks around the world are facing political pressure. So the political pressure on the Fed is particularly intense at the moment in the US. So we have two interconnected papers on this topic. So I'm going to cover some of the major contents for both papers. So what do we do? So we study how political identity and perceived Fed alignment shape public trust, the formation of macroeconomic expectations, and the responsiveness to Fed communication. We conducted two large-scale politically representative surveys of the US consumers. The first survey experiment was implemented in April last year under the Biden administration and before the presidential election last year. And the second survey experiment was implemented in January last year and on President Trump's inauguration day. So let me briefly explain our approach. we measure respondents' political identity and, importantly, their perceived political stance of the Fed and trust in the Fed. In the first experiment, we randomized information sources. So the information sources include the Federal Reserve, CNN, or Fox News. And the experimental design allows us to study the effects of information sources on consumers' behavior of acquiring and processing economic information. In the second experiment, we randomized the content framing. So we explained institutional design or nonpartisan objectives or recent performance of the Fed in the first stage. And after that, we present the same Fed information to all participants. So this design allows us to study the effects of kind of communication intervention at the first stage on information processing in the second stage. So because we measure both political identity and the respondents perceive the political stance of the Fed, this allows us to determine whether respondents view the Fed as an in-group or out-group institution. So we are particularly interested in testing whether in-group versus out-group perceptions mediate willingness to engage with and update macro beliefs from Fed communication. So here's an overview of the findings. First, the public sees the Fed through a partisan lens. Most Republican-leaning and Democrat-leaning respondents think the Fed favors the other side. And second, the perceptions of Fed shape beliefs and behavior. So we find that respondents who perceive the Fed as an outgroup report lower trust in the Fed, high inflation and unemployment expectations, and a lower willingness to receive or engage with Fed information. And third, strategic communication can help messages about the Fed's institutional structure, mandate, and past performance help to improve perceived political neutrality of the Fed, trust in Fed, and increase responsiveness to policy signals. Here's an overview of the first survey. We elicited demographics, political identity, perception of the Fed, macro expectations, and then we conducted information demand and information processing experiment. And at the post-treatment stage, we elicited macro expectations. So the survey was fielded in April last year under Biden administration with over 5,000 participants recruited through Prolific. The sample is representative of the US population. So we elicited the respondents perceived the political leaning of the Fed, and we also have two trust measures. So the first measure is trust in Fed's ability in managing inflation and unemployment, and the second measure is trust in objectives. So to what extent the Fed cares the economic well-being of all Americans. And then we elicited the macro expectations. Okay, this figure shows you respondents perceive the political leaning of the Fed by their own political leaning. So the red bars are Republican-leaning respondents. So for instance here, so about 20% of the Republican-leaning respondents think the Fed leans moderately toward the Democratic Party. So about 50% of Republican-leaning respondents think the Fed leans strongly toward the Democratic Party, and 30% of Republican-leaning respondents think the Fed is closer to Democratic Party. So taking this together, the majority of Republican-leaning respondents think the Fed leans toward the Democratic Party, and similarly, the majority of Democrat-leaning respondents think the Fed leans toward the Republican Party. So we look at the belief gaps between in-group and the out-group respondents. So the in-group respondents is defined as respondents who perceive the Fed as aligned with their own party, and the out-group is respondents who believe the Fed favors the opposing party. And then we look at the belief gaps between in-group and out-group respondents. We find that in-group respondents report high trust in the Fed. They have lower inflation expectations. So the average 1 year ahead inflation expectation was 3.2%. The corresponding number for the out-group respondent was 5.0%. So the gap between the in-group and out-group inflation expectation is about 2 percentage points. And this gap is larger than the partisan gap, which is 1.1 percentage points. And the effects are still significant after controlling for demographics, including party affiliations. So this shows you the trust in Fed by out-group and in-group respondents. So trust is measured by trust in Fed's ability to adequately manage inflation and unemployment. So 1 means no trust at all, and 7 means complete trust. So the red bars are out-group respondents, and the red bars are in-group respondents. So the out-group respondents have lower trust in the Fed, while the in-group respondents have higher trust. And so let me talk about the information demand and the information processing experiments. We randomly assign participants to either the control or treatment group. Respondents in the control group do not go through information demand stage, so they go directly to the information processing stage. At this stage, they receive an article without information about its source. And respondents in the treatment group go through 2 stages. So the first stage is the information demand stage. So the participants are endowed with a budget, and they can adjust the probability of receiving a news article from 2 different sources, but at a cost. So we measure their willingness to pay for different information sources. At the information processing stage, then the participants receive a news article with a logo indicating its source based on the probabilities they had set at the information demand stage. So all participants in the control group and treatment group received the news article with identical contents. So the only difference is the information source. So this design allows us to study the effects of information sources on information processing. So this is the decision screen for the information demand stage. In this case, the participant faces a choice between receiving information from CNN versus the Federal Reserve. And the default probabilities are 50-50. And for every dollar spent, you can change the probabilities by 10%. So in this case, the participant spent $1 out of $2 to increase the probability of receiving information from CNN. So the probability of receiving information from CNN becomes 60%. So how does political alignment shape information demand? So the left panel plots money spent, and the right panel plots the probability of receiving news from the Fed. So we look at the heterogeneity between 2 groups of respondents. So the first group is those who face the choice between in-group news source versus Fed. And so the other group are the respondents who face a choice between out-group news sources versus Fed. So the participants are more willing to spend money to avoid information from out-group news sources, and this increases their likelihood of receiving news from the Fed. So here again, so the left panel is the average money spent, and the right panel plots the probability of receiving news from Fed. So here we look at the heterogeneity between in-group respondents and out-group respondents. So the in-group respondents are more willing to pay for news from the Fed, and they have a higher probability to receive Fed news. And out-group respondents prefer media sources like CNN or Fox News.
Hey, can I just ask a clarifying question?
Yes, please.
Out of this money that they could spend, what happens if they don't spend it? Do they keep it?
Yes, exactly. They keep it. Yeah.
Wow, I'm amazed that any of them spent it.
So actually, okay. So I think a lot of, I mean, most of them spent some money. Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So okay, this is the information processing stage. So basically, so the respondents are shown this article, which is curated from the Federal Reserve statement. So this article has information about the recent inflation data, and also has information about the inflation target and the Fed funds rate decision. So this is the Fed News Group. So there's a logo of Fed Reserve here. So the respondent in the control group received exactly the same article. So the only difference is that there's no indication of information source. So there's no logo here. And there's also a CNN News Group and Fox News Group. So all respondents received the same articles. The only difference is the logo. So for the CNN group, then you have a CNN logo here. So if it's the Fox News group, then there's a logo of Fox News. Okay, then we re-elicit the participants' inflation expectations after the information provision. And then we run this Bayesian learning model. So on the left-hand side, there's posterior inflation expectations. And on the right-hand side, this is prior inflation expectations. And this is a treatment group dummy. And then you have this interaction between treatment and group dummy and prior expectation. So B0 is the weight placed on prior expectation by the control group, and BJ is the weight placed on prior by the treatment group relative to the control group. So this coefficient BJ allows us to identify the effect of news sources among different groups of respondents. And on the next slide, I'm going to plot this estimate of BJ for different sources of news. So here, so as I said, we plot the estimate of BJ. So that's weight on prior relative to the control. And so here are the three information sources. One is Fed news, and then in-group media and out-group media. So I think the most interesting part is here. So we look at the heterogeneity between in-group respondents and out-group respondents. So this is in-group respondents, this is out-group respondents. So after receiving the Fed news, both groups of respondents reduce weight on prior. So they put some information on the, put some weight on the new information. So the in-group respondents, they put more weight on the new information. Okay, so there's a larger reduction in the weight on prior. So they are more responsive to the Fed information. Okay, so excuse me. So in the second wave, we study whether targeted communication can improve receptiveness of Fed communication, mitigate the polarization. So the key modules of the survey are following. So we elicited a perceived Fed independence and the trust in Fed under new administration. So we then elicited the macro expectations. We randomized the Fed communication intervention, which I've explained on the next slide. And we conducted a follow-up survey to assess the treatment effects 1 week after the main survey. So the main survey was fielded on President Trump's inauguration day in January 2025, recruiting over 5,000 respondents, representative of the US population. So the respondents are randomly assigned into one of the 4 groups. So the first group is the control group. The control group does not receive any communication intervention. And the first treatment group receives information about the institutional design of the Fed. Basically, we describe the appointment structure and the Fed terms, emphasizing bipartisan FOMC composition. And the second treatment group receives information about the nonpartisan mandate of the Fed. We highlighted the Fed's dual mandates of price stability and the maximum employment, framing goals as inclusive and apolitical. And the third group received information about the recent performance of the Fed. We recounted post-COVID inflation and interest rate policy, showing how the Fed acted to bring inflation down. So after this communication intervention, we present all respondents the same article, summarizing the most recent FOMC announcement. And then we re-elicited the respondents' information, inflation, unemployment, and interest rate expectations. So, I mean, this design allows us to study the effects of this communication intervention on information processing in this stage. So, and again, we estimate the Bayesian learning model. So, so we are interested in these BJ coefficients, the coefficient that capture the effects of Fed communication intervention. So these are the estimated BJs. So just recall that the BJ is the weight on the prior relative to the control group. And these are the estimated BJs for the 3 treatment groups. And we look at the 3 forecasts. So this is 5-year ahead inflation forecasts. And this is 1 year ahead interest rate forecast. And this is unemployment rate forecast. So, I mean, the estimated BJs are generally negative. So this means that the communication interventions improve the receptiveness to Fed information. So in these treatment groups, respondents place more weight on the Fed information relative to the control group. And remember, in the control group, the respondents also get the same Fed information. Okay, so then we contacted the respondents 1 week after the initial survey to reassess trust, perceived political leaning, and the perceived independence of the Fed. So here are the findings. So first, we find that so the likelihood of perceiving the Fed as politically neutral increased after this communication intervention. So all treatments raised the odds the Fed is seen as nonpartisan. So the explaining the institutional background shows the largest lift. And the second, the trust in the Fed improved following the communication interventions. I'm particularly explaining the institutional background and the nonpartisan objectives of the Fed boost the trust that the Fed cares about the economic well-being of all Americans. And the third, the perceived degree of independence also improved, and particularly explaining the non-partisan objectives lifted the perceived degree of independence. Okay, so here are the takeaways. The perceived political alignment matters. We find that in-group versus out-group perceptions dominates raw party affiliation in shaping trusts and macro expectations. And the information source and framing drive engagement with Fed communication. Particularly, people are more willing to demand and engage with news from the Fed when viewed as in-group. And finally, targeted Fed messages can improve receptiveness of Fed information and mitigate polarization. Simple messages on institutional design, nonpartisan mandates, and the recent performance improve trust and perceptions of the Fed. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Perfect, and great to get on time. So we can enter the general discussion in a second, but I have a couple of questions for you. So there was one so one finding which again I find very intuitive and relates to stuff that I've done actually in the Teach Don't Give paper. This idea that actually just understanding the institution goes a long way to improving trust. You know, you may not even have to teach them mental models. You may not have to teach them to think like an economist. You just have to convince them that, the people at the Fed are independent, or the Bank of England, ECB, wherever, choose your favorite independent central bank, and that this is just something that isn't in common knowledge. So that's I think an interesting result. There was one finding that you had, which was quite striking, which is that in-group inflation expectations are lower. So in other words, those who think of the Fed as on their side have lower inflation expectations vis-a-vis those who think they're not. What I wondered is, within that, you said something like, we also control for political affiliation in that regression. Does political affiliation still matter?
Okay, so I think after controlling political affiliation, I think this coefficient on the intergroup preferences didn't change much. I think so there's still quite a large gap between those who view in inflation expectation between those who view Fed as in-group versus out-group. So in the sense, this in-group or out-group perceptions play a much larger role than the raw political affiliation. I think the raw political affiliation matters to some extent, but this in-group out-group perceptions play a much larger role. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm gonna use this to ask this. Sammy asked a question during the talk, and I just said I'd deal with it later because I think it applies to both. And I think a question that often comes up with this type of intervention, and we touched on it a little bit with Yoon talking about how they managed to understand what I think of as relatively complex interventions, and that is, do you have any sense of the quality or financial literacy or economic literacy of the participants that you had? I think, Pei, did you also use Prolific?
Exactly, we
Yeah.
use that. Yeah.
So let me tell you, just so you don't have to go back and read it. I answered, and I'm a regular user of Prolific. I think that on average, the Prolific people are pretty good. You know, there was a long time when people worried about using MTurk, and you just get college students coming in after a few drinks and doing some stuff that they pay no attention to, and Prolific essentially tries to address that. I'm not advertising for Prolific, use your favorite survey participant recruitment tool, but Prolific does it very well in my view. And I think on average you get sort of attentive and probably on average slightly better than the average in the population in terms of they select into economic topics, so they have slightly more interest, right? The ones who hate economics probably never click on the link that appears in their inbox. So that was my answer. But if either of you want to answer on the levels of financial literacy and economic literacy in your samples, that would be useful for the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I guess we probably didn't have a lot of question about financial literacy, but I'm not worried about this concern. I think our information treatment are really simple, so they are not as complicated as like Young's. So I think the high school children can understand that. So it's just a couple of sentences and really simple English. So I'm not worried about the financial literacy. Yeah.
I don't know if you've.
We didn't have a specific questions to elicit financial literacy or economic literacy, but again, the comprehension test, all of the treatment, more than 92% of the respondents actually were correct on the message itself. So that's something we rely on.
Yeah. So they are pretty good. Okay, and so I guess the big question on the monetary side, and I'm going to start on the monetary side because that's the name of the webinar. One of the big questions would be, okay, so what is the advice we can now give to central banks, knowing that they're in a, I would say, much more politically charged world than maybe historically. And look, I know the Fed is probably going through it now more than they have recently. But so the UK, the Bank of England under Mark Carney fell into this like around the Brexit period. At one level, it seems crazy to think that a central bank filled with really good economists should not be thinking about the economic effects of a really big structural change like Brexit. At the same time, any utterances from the central bank were largely viewed as a kind of in-group, out-group, them and us, don't take sides. And that's a really, I guess that was a difficult time for the bank here. So yeah, I wonder how, if either of you or both of you have projected from your own results on the literature to think, what would you say if Jay Powell sat you down and said, help? Now I'm going to have to call on you because you're both now claiming silence as a way to try to hope the other person will answer this question. Right, Pei, you can go first on this one, and then you will come to you.
Okay, so I think it's important to understand better why some people view the Fed as out group. I mean, like, so I think there are some welfare cost associated with viewing the Fed as outgroup. So I mean, we find that like outgroup respondents, they have less trust in the Fed, and there's a smaller probability for them to receive Fed communication, and condition on receiving Fed news, they put less weight on the Fed information. So I mean, I think so as a consequence, I think the inflation expectations could deviate more persistently from inflation targets, and this could generate welfare losses. Um, uh, so I feel it's important to understand why they um, view the Fed as an outgroup, and also and maybe it will be desirable to reduce the proportion of respondents who view the Fed as outgroup.
Okay,
And
did you
yeah,
check that actually? Did you notice some of your formerly outgroup people,
mm.
did they shift to behave like in-group people, even if you didn't ask them if they now view the Fed as in-group?
So are you talking about like after the inauguration of
Yes,
uh,
so like T1
okay.
and T2 of yours, the sort of the objectives and the institutional design seem like things that could have made people at least become more neutral on the Fed. So I don't know. Um, did you show? I don't think you showed us a measure of that. If I did, I apologize if I missed it.
Oh, so I think yes. So after these communication interventions, then I
Right.
think
So trust and
yes.
independence went up, but do we know
Yeah.
if they now think of them more as in group? I guess that's the
Uh,
question. Do they think they're
so
more aligned with their own party?
so here I think there are a higher proportion of respondents view the Fed as politically neutral. So we know that. So we yeah because we uh, ask them about their perceived neutrality of the Fed after uh, so in the follow-up survey. So we know that
Okay.
many people change their views about uh, the political leaning, perceived political leaning. So that they kind of become to view the Fed as politically neutral. So we
So
know that.
so
Yeah. So there are
so
some shifts going on.
that's the key answer to J Powell then. What you
Okay.
got to do is keep telling people this is how we're set up. This is what we're designed to do. This is why we do it independently. And this is which is, of course, is what he has been doing. But yeah, I mean, it's nice to have that reinforced with results. Yoon, I don't know if you had any thoughts on what you would advise.
For me, though, that's the exact question that I started this paper, because every policy actions, people view it as a partisan lenses. But we actually, as an economist, we know and we have a framework to evaluate policy in a non-partisan way. So we thought that if we just teach what, as an economist, do think about effective policy, whether we can, close the gap of this partisan divergence. We did have shown a little convergence, but not entirely. So that's why one thing we can think of is not just like letting them know what happened in economic research, but whether we really give a lesson about how nonpartisan research economic outcome would be for each type of policy. So if I have to make an inference from our paper, we'll have to advertise more neutral nonpartisan, like research-based outcome on like policy actions.
Okay. Um, so I have sort of one other sort of really big question, which takes us a little bit beyond, but and maybe it just reveals what I'm thinking about. So some people on this call will know that I do a lot of my research on central bank communication, but they'll also know I've spent the last nearly 7 years as a fiscal council member, meaning I'm in an independent fiscal institution that assesses and advises on fiscal policy. And I guess one of the things, and this just tells you, I'm now revealing where I'm going with some of my research thinking, is that clearly how those institutions and how fiscal institutions communicate is sort of important. In fact, I would say it's very important right now. We can pick many countries in the OECD that are currently or will soon be at a fiscal precipice where the demands on someone cutting spending or someone raising taxes or some combination of both is going to become sort of crisis time. And so there's a question when you then communicate on fiscal issues. I think both of your past answer for the Fed can't apply because fiscal choices are necessarily political. I don't think any intervention is going to make registered Democrats think that the Democratic government, the Republican government is a Democrat or vice versa. So what should we as a profession do? Or what can we think about for communicating in this world, Yoon, that you've highlighted, where everything, all policies are viewed through partisan lenses, but what about communicating necessary partisan policies? Any thoughts on that?
I think again we should just teach what we teach at intermediate macro costs. When we teach intermediate macro costs, it doesn't attach which government has which partisan lenses. So I think this teaching something neutral economic framework or give a lessons from it should be very important thing to do as an economist.
Hey, do you want to chip in on that?
So, okay, so I'm not sure. I don't have a good answer for that for the moment.
No, that's okay. It's a tough question. But I think I do just again revealing because I think this partisanship and the Fed is a very obviously interesting one for people who care about central bank communication. But there are, as Yoon, where your research started, there are so many other parts of um of this sort of world that we also have to think about, where they and again, I think more now than we did certainly when I started grad school, when we used to be in a happy world of an independent central bank and a fiscal agent, and they we sort of thought about their policies as a separate. We know there are huge monetary and fiscal interactions. They're in our first year and intermediate macro models. The effect of a Fed action or policy, a fiscal action, depends on the reaction of the other. But I guess, yeah. So I think I like that. I'm gonna just because that's my favorite person to quote on this issue at the moment, and I think it fits with Yoon's answer certainly. David Spiegelhalter, who was at University of Cambridge he was the professor of public understanding of risk and uncertainty. He was incredibly central in the messaging around COVID vaccinations in the UK. But his big thing about policy communication, and I think it's a motto we should all have, is that you are there to inform, not persuade. So to rephrase Yoon's answer, that would be, let's tell people on the fiscal side, here's the menu of options and the likely implications of them. But then I guess ultimately we have to leave to democratically elected folk who have to convince the populace that this is the right choice from that menu. And of course, that's where partisanship will probably never disappear. Petra has just asked one question, which I'll throw in, and it'll nicely bring us away from my current thinking about fiscal back to central banks. And that is the notion that the Fed is non-partisan is currently seriously undermined by President Trump. What are the likely effects of this according to your analysis? And how can the political attack on the central bank independence be best mitigated? So I guess this is partly related to what we just said, but can you think of any ways to stop the attacks? Any research on that?
Okay, so not about the stopping attacks, but okay, so the likely effects of that. So I mean, I think like what I presented in so basically, I mean, I think the perceived degree of independence are associated with are closely associated with expectations. So okay, I think in our paper we also find that like if a respondent perceives a lower degree of independence, then so this participant also tends to have high inflation expectations. So I think so there's this kind of association between perceived degree of independence and the macroeconomic expectations, and okay, so I think how can the political attack on central bank independence best be mitigated? I think we like in the second service we ran this RCT, and so we found that communicating this like institutional structure, the non-partisan objective, and the recent performance had a quite a significant effect on the perceived central bank independence and the trust in the Fed.
Okay, Yoon, do you have anything to add to that?
So do we not know about from the Francesco Bianchi's paper and Drexel's paper, when central bank independence undermined, we expect to have a high inflation. Again, if we let them know what are the consequences of it, I think that's one way we can somewhat resolve the issue on central bank independence. That's just my idea.
I'll add one extra thing, and I'm going to sort of cite, if people don't know this person, he was very prominent in the UK central banking. There's a former deputy governor called Paul Tucker, who has written a really excellent book, which I happen to have here. I don't get commission for this either, but it's called Unelected Power. It's a big chunky book, but the book is about lots of things, but really asks the question. It's not a brand new book. It's been out for quite a while, but he had this expression I had a conversation with him at a dinner once, and he told me this line, and I've taken it very much to heart, that when it comes to kind of influencing the public, politicians are better than technocrats, because to get to the top of politics, it's your bread and butter. You have to convince people. To get to the top of central banking, you typically have to be like, a good technical policy maker, but not necessarily good at winning popularity contests. And so his line was, in that world where they will always win the battle for hearts and minds, he goes, you can't beat them, but you can surround them, which I take to mean that, if we make the case for central bank independence so well that the population believe in it, that the population would find it unthinkable that a politician would attack it, politicians won't attack it. The reason it's open season in some countries is because people don't strongly have this belief that central bank independence is beneficial or helpful or whatever. So that would be my answer. I've got one last question before we wrap up, and this comes from Ellen Mead. And this is a tough one. I have no idea how to answer this, so we'll see where we get. What if the data are viewed as suspect, as they are in some cases in the US right now? If data are not facts, then what can be trusted? I don't know if anyone's... So Ellen, I'm going to start answering this because I think that's a really hard question for everybody. But I don't know if anybody's done a paper that talks about trust in data and then how you respond to data. And I guess it would be a super interesting paper. I often think, how can we live in a world where, I look at the data and it says inflation is high or low, or it's been high and it's come down, or whatever the data is, and I sort of trust the data. And then you say it to people and they go, oh, no, I don't believe that. One thing I would say on that, and inflation is one example, I think people in general don't well understand inflation. So there's this clear error where people mix up the price level and inflation. So, if central bankers come out and say inflation is back under control at target, people will go, no, I went to the shops, eggs still cost 50% more than they did 3 years ago. You're lying. And again, both are correct. The price level has permanently gone up, but the rate of increase has changed. And that, I think, is a really difficult part where lack of understanding of complex, well, I guess not that complex, but for people, complex ideas of economics can impinge upon their willingness to listen. And again, every time a central banker comes out again and says inflation is back under control, it just loses more and more credibility because, again, egg prices are still high. When are they going back down? And we know the answer is they won't. But Pei or Yoon, do you want to try and answer anything on data? Like I say, if either of you or anybody knows of a paper that looks at trust in data and wants to send it to me, I'd be super interested.
Okay, I think it's quite hard. Yeah, no, I haven't come across this kind of paper.
I guess it boils down to all the education, like based on the data, how they can process it, or how they can inference based on data is done by all education, I believe. So I assume all the participants in the seminar would help us educate using the data or how we interpret policy actions.
Yeah, I guess I would add one extra thing, which is I think the one public good that we probably often take for granted in countries is the value of our independent institutions. And I guess we take them for granted because, I mean, I've had to deal with this as a member of a fiscal council. We are there to basically hold the government's feet to the fire and question why they're doing this or why they're doing that. I'm sure they think we are a pain in the backside and their lives would be easier without us. But if you think about what the counterfactuals are, the reasons they exist are exactly to try to make sure we don't get wild swings in fiscal policy. That's why we have independent central banks, so we get appropriate monetary policy. And I guess when we get used to appropriate policy and things got pretty good for long periods, we take for granted a bit those institutions. I guess the attack on data is new, but not always unwarranted, right? That there are challenges facing statistical agencies, and in the UK, they are particularly striking. Our National Statistics Agency here has had such trouble with survey responses since COVID. They were falling a bit before, but they really had trouble with their responses after that. For many years now, we have had questionable real-time information on unemployment. Again, I don't think I've ever stood up in a class of first-year students and said, here's unemployment, here's what it is, number of people not working but ready and available for work, and then said, we don't really know what it is right now. That seems crazy to me, but in some cases, we do need to ensure we have good data. And there, I guess the answer, Ellen, would be we need to not only make the case for independent institutions and good data and trustworthy data, but we also need to continually invest to ensure that we don't introduce a possibility that these can be attacked, as they have been in the UK for what is actually quite bad data at the moment. So, yeah, it's a tough world. Gosh, I started this more optimistic. I think my optimism started at a certain level. It went up and up as I saw the results. And now I've managed to get myself down on a low that we're all in trouble. We've got to keep fighting, people. Okay, well, on that note, I will stop just before we get to the absolute hard stop. But let me thank both of you. Pei, you can now go to sleep. Yoon, you can now go get a coffee and enjoy a long, fruitful day ahead. But to everybody, thank you for joining. And to both of you especially, thank you for presenting. And I'll clap on behalf of everyone. And yeah, I look forward to seeing everybody next time.